Today, I want to go back to the early 20th century because over the last week or so, we've been rioting in Ferguson, Missouri. We've been protesting. But all of our protests today seem to be based on the nonviolent protests in the 60s and the 50s. We base our protests on the nonviolent, passive protests of the civil rights movement. But today I want to skip over the civil rights movement and go back to the protests of the early 20th century. They weren't nonviolent. They were violent protests. So we're going to start on page 481 of the book From Slavery to Freedom, A History of Negro Americans by John Hope Franklin, that was copywritten in 1947. This is some serious information, y'all. I don't know why. Actually, I do. But I don't want to tell you. I want you to think and not regurgitate. Ask yourself why you don't know anything about this history. It says, in July of 1919, in Longview, Texas witnessed the nightmare of a race riot. Several white men were shot. I said, several white men were shot when they went into the Negro section of the town in search of a Negro school teacher who was accused of sending a release to the Chicago Defender, which was a newspaper in Chicago, concerning the lynching of a Negro during the previous month. Whites of the town were alarmed over the show of strength among the Negroes. I said, whites of the town were alarmed over the show of strength among the Negroes. That was in Longview, Texas. This is a response to the white people that came in aggressively. The Negroes, black men and women, shot them. But let's go from Longview, Texas to Washington, D.C. It says that newspaper reports of Negroes assaulting white women whipped the irresponsible elements of the white population into a frenzy, although it early became clear that the reports had no basis in fact. It was a rumor. Mobs consisting primarily of white sailors, soldiers, and Marines ran amok through the streets of Washington, D.C. for 3 days, killing several Negroes and injuring scores of others. On the third day, the Negroes retaliated when hoodlums sought to invade and burn the Negro section of the city. The casualty list mounted, but before order was restored, the number of whites killed and wounded was increased considerably due to the stern action of the Negroes. So we talked about Longview, Texas. Then we moved to D.C. Let's look at Chicago. It says the most serious racial outbreak occurred in Chicago late in July of the Red Summer. They called it the Red Summer because it was so bloody. In June, 2 Negroes were murdered in an act that ushered in a month of terror. The riot that began on July 27th had its immediate origin in an altercation at a Lake Michigan beach. A young Negro swimming offshore had drifted into water that was customarily used by whites. White swimmers commanded him to return to his part of the beach, and some threw stones at him. When the young Negro went down and drowned, the Negroes declared that he had been murdered. In the next afternoon, white bystanders meddled with Negroes as they went home from work. Some were pulled off streetcars and whipped. On the south side, it says the Negro South Side of Chicago, a group of young Negroes stabbed an old Italian peddler to death, and a white laundry operator was also stabbed to death. For 14 days, Chicago was without law and order, despite the fact that the militia was called out on the 4th day of the riot. When the authorities counted the casualties, the tally sheet gave the appearance of the results of a miniature war. Although it had been customary that Negroes, black people, were killed at the hands of white people, and black people definitely were killed during these riots. But black people weren't the only ones dying in the early 20th century. It says that 15 whites were killed and 178 whites were injured. So just remember, there's more than one way to respond to racial terrorism. We've been used to responding to racial terrorism in the style of nonviolent turn the other cheek civil rights movement. But that's only one little piece of our history, one little 20-year period of our history. But if you go back to the early 20th century, you'll find out that it wasn't all about no damn nonviolence. Our people were standing up, armed, and responding in kind to racial terrorism. This has been Daku Akabo Wa'akatu. And remember, think and don't regurgitate. I leave you with this clip from young Kwame Ture, who was at the time Stokely Carmichael. Peace.
Its youthful leader, Stokely Carmichael. You have two generations, the generation that Martin Luther King Jr. represents and the generation that Stokely Carmichael represents. And Dr. King's message was really wearing thin in this latter half of the 1960s, particularly because there's so much violence.
As the violence grew, the willingness to be passive declined.
Do you think you'll be able to keep it nonviolent, Dr. King?
Yes, I think so. I don't have any doubt in my mind about that.
Mr. Carmichael, are you as committed to the nonviolent approach as Dr. King is?
No, I'm not.
Why aren't you?
Well, I just don't see it as a way of life. I never have.
The Meredith March is where Stokely Carmichael becomes an icon.
No one in this country is asking the white community in the South to be nonviolent. And that, in a sense, is giving them a free license to go ahead and shoot us at will.